Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Conscience, though? What is the conscience? It's simply the case that there is some voice within ourselves that tells us what is right and what is wrong. Normally, as human beings, what happens is that these voices, when we're babies and children, these voices come to us from the outside, telling us what's right and what's wrong, what's good or what's bad, telling us to do certain things or to not do certain things. Be quiet, sit down. Think of all the adult voices that have talked to you during the years. Those voices get into our head, and we start internalizing all those voices. The example that Father Richard used in his book is of a father who goes and yells at his son because his son got up at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and he's not aware of, it's time for him to get up. So he's up and he's making noise, and the father says, "Go back to bed." And the boy, goes back to bed and, starts getting rested or whatever. The father comes back and yells again. And says whatever strong message the father says. Be quiet, etc. What happens was, this boy is getting these messages from the outside. Father Richard tells the story in this book of how it was that that boy, when the father went back a little later and noticed that things were quiet, went back to the door and he heard his son saying to himself, being a restless kid, right? Getting ready to get outside the bed and saying, "Oh, get in bed." Telling himself, he was internalizing all of these messages. What his father was telling him, he was now internalizing. And isn't that what happens to all of us? We internalize all of these messages that come to us from without. And so one of the challenges that we have is distinguishing the conscience, what's within us, from the superego, which is all of these voices that have come to us from outside. So let's talk about the superego first. So Sigmund Freud had this idea where there's the ego, the id, and the superego. What is the superego? Is that the ego in a red cape? The superego is this concept of where we have this internal censor regulating our behavior by guilt because of the voices that have told us what we should do, what we have to do, what we ought to do, so that if I leave my bedroom in the morning and the bed is not made, I just have this sense that something is going off inside of me because I have to make my bed. Wait a minute. What do you mean I have to make my bed? Where did that come from? That came from some voice. You follow me? Whatever voices we've picked up, anytime we hear the word should or have to or ought to, Father Richard Gula says, those are coming from the superego. That's not your conscience talking. That's coming from some outside voice. Oh, I should go to the gym. I should get more exercise. I should eat healthier. Okay? Where's that coming from? There are voices that are influencing us who are telling us certain things.
And it depends on the culture they're coming from. If you're in a culture that doesn't teach you anything, that you do whatever you want, and your parents don't care, and
Georg Hofstede says, what is culture? He says it's the software of your mind. Think about it for a moment. Because essentially it's how you're programmed to think. Whether you're programmed to make up your bed or not results from your culture, how you're programmed to think.
that's what's very hard for us teachers. We have to get kids from different cultures and to guide them on what's acceptable in a society, in our society. But some cases, no. My mother said something else, my parents. And that's what's very difficult for you and for us that have to work with people.
So what happens is we have certain voices coming from the outside
And
that essentially program us to think the way that we think. So if you ever catch yourself saying the word should, oh, I should do this, I should do that, etc., all those come to us from the various voices that have programmed us, right? Coming from the outside, from the superego, Richard Gula says. So the challenge is we get these messages from authorities, if you will, from the outside, telling us what's good and bad, or to do or don't do certain things. In contrast, the conscience is something on the inside, where it's essentially you wanting to do something rather than feeling that you have to do something. When you're driving home tonight feeling like you have to pray the rosary before you go to bed, is that coming from inside? Or is that the superego? The conscience on the inside is saying, you know what, before I go to bed tonight, I think I'll pray the rosary. That's coming from the inside. There's a difference between the voice that says, you should do something, versus the voice that says, I want to do. And so the example that he has is that of Father Frank McNulty. Father Frank McNulty, fascinating story. You can read it on page 129 of the book, where there's a wake service of a friend's father, so he feels like he should go to the wake service. I should go to the wake service because of my friend. Challenge is that he's not dressed appropriately. You know how it is. We're just relaxing for the day and in shorts or whatever. And so, okay. So he's feeling okay. Well, trying to balance this super ego, the voice from without. Well, I should dress a certain way to go to the funeral, etc. Right? The super ego versus the conscience, essentially deciding in the end, you know what? I'm just going to go. I want to go. Even though I should dress differently for it, etc. No. How do we balance this super ego, all these voices that come from outside of us, all this should language, versus us wanting to do certain things? In pastoral counseling, then, that's why we never should on people, right? When someone comes to you for advice, even if it's your own child or a grandchild, please self-monitor. Never use the word should, because once you use the word should, it's coming from outside. It's part of the superego. Oh, but Grandma said I should, whatever, right? So it's not them making the decision. It's them hearing Grandma's voice saying you should do this or you shouldn't do that. And then what happens when they do those things and find out that it wasn't what they believe they should have done? Who do they blame? The person who told them, right? The priest or the deacon, they go to the priest or the deacon with help with something, and they say, what should I do? Oh, no. Right? I'm not going to say it like that. Essentially, I'll always answer a question with a question, right? What do you think I should do? Well, what do you think you should do? Probably put it back on them. Because if the answer comes from them, if the idea comes from them, they do it, then who's responsible? It's on them. If instead they say, well, what should I do? I say, well, I think what you should do is you should go talk to the person, and then suddenly, wait a minute, when they do those things, whose responsibility on? Comes back to me, because I told them that they should do that, and they did it.
So is there a difference between should and ought?
We're putting them all on the same list here. So if you tell a person, you should do this, or you ought to do this, or you have to do this, careful. They'll do those things, but then it's coming from the external voice, from the outside, from the super ego, rather than from something that they want to do, right? When we tell a child, tell them you're sorry. Okay, that's the outside authority, telling them to say that they're sorry. Is it coming from the inside, something they want to do? No. So they'll do it, but it doesn't impact who they are. So in pastoral counseling, we never use words like should, so that people can act out of their own personally committed freedom rather than acting out of the super ego. And that way, what is the challenge then? When someone comes to us and asks, what should I do? It's helping them to figure out what they believe they could do, helping them to see the alternatives, especially in light of Scripture and the teachings of the church.
Morally.
That's right. So they're coming to us as priests and deacons. We have some knowledge of Scripture and the church's teachings. How can we help a person make the best decision for him or her in that situation? You're going to make the decision at the end of the day. I just have Scripture and a certain tradition to pull from to be able to help you if it helps you. So simply put then, conscience is me coming to a decision, says Father Richard Gula. It's not the voices from the outside telling you what you should do and forcing your decision one way or another. No, it's you coming to a decision. What do you want to do in this situation? Andy?
One of the reasons I'll follow you is because you know so much more. So to throw it back at me and ask me what I think I should do, it seems like you...
I know a lot, but I don't know your life, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So when you come to me, Cynthia comes to me and says, Father, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. What do you think I should do? Well, you know your life better than I, which is why I turn the question on you and say, what do you think you should do? And I say, you know the situation better. What we're going to do is, the next chapter we come to, we're going to have various questions that we ask in terms of the formation of the conscience. And this who, what, where, when, why, how, if we read ahead during this coming week, gives us some idea of some of the questions that we might ask ourselves, right? Okay? What are the different options? Cynthia's coming to me asking me, Father, what should I do? Well, what are some of the options? Well, do I talk to Mary Helen? Do I ignore, let's talk about the various options. What are the possible consequences? What's the results of the relationship, etc. So that at the end of the day, you can make the decision that you think is the best decision in that situation. Rather than me saying, well, you should talk to her about that. As counselors, we don't tell people what to do. Not typically. That is to say, we are counseling them, but we're not telling them, you should do this or you should do that. It's trying to help them. Going back to the beginning of the segment, we talked about psychologists using different language, right? About adaptive, healthy behaviors, helping them to see the consequences of their actions, and helping them to come to the best
There's
decisions
only
that they're
two
going to make.
things we have to say. If they're gonna hurt themselves, gonna kill themselves, we have to say, stop,
They have to
right there.
intervene.
Or when they're gonna hurt someone.
So presuming no one's going to get hurt, them or someone else, then it's journeying with them. It's not making their decisions for them. Not telling them what to do, what they should do, shouldn't do, need to do, don't need to do, etc. So the next chapter in Father Richard Gula's book is called The Formation of Conscience. Now that we've talked about conscience, this internal regulator that we have, we distinguish between the conscience and the superego. You remember that the superego are those voices that have come to us throughout our lives saying that we ought to do certain things, that we should do certain things. Wait a minute, that's not the conscience. Our conscience is something that comes from inside of us where we reflect on those other voices but also the experiences of life, and we come to figure out what it is that's right or wrong, good or bad in any situation. The regulator that we have is our conscience. So where does this conscience come from and what is it comprised of? The conscience is the formation of conscience is comprised of our ability to assess morally relevant factors. The formation of our conscience is comprised of the ability to assess morally relevant factors, which simply means that in any situation, it's our ability to take a look at that situation and figure out what are those factors that are important when it comes to making a decision. The ability to provide sound reasons for moral judgment, so our ability to look at that situation and figure out, okay, let's reason through this, let's figure out what are the reasons for which I'm going to make the judgment, take the action I'm going to take. And also the ability to have a decisive will to execute a judgment. So it's not just saying that I should do something or I could do something, but it's actually having the will to do whatever it is that I decide to do. So the question in terms of the formation of the conscience is not so much what should I do in this situation, but given the options that I have, what sort of a person am I becoming or would I become if I were to choose different actions? If I choose to tell the truth or not in a certain situation, how does that determine the type of person that I'm becoming? Conscience is formed in dialogue with sources of moral wisdom, which simply means that there are various voices, sources we call them, of moral wisdom, various voices that can help us to think about what's right or wrong, good or bad in any situation. What are some of those sources? They would include things like our own experience. My own experience tells me that certain things are good and certain things are bad. Eating is a good thing when I'm hungry, right? It's a bad thing to experience hunger. My experience tells me certain things are good and bad. Also, the experiences of family members, friends, colleagues, experts. Isn't it true that we learn a lot online these days about what's good or bad for ourselves, for our health? As Christians, we also turn to Scripture and creeds and the lives of people like the saints and theologians who help us to interpret our traditions. So there are other sources of wisdom that we can turn to as Christians, and those would include things that are specific to us as Christians and Catholics, things like the Bible. We believe that the Bible contains some wisdom for us. As a Christian community, we have stories and images, language, rituals, practices, things that we do, and stories that we tell. Where are many of those stories from? A lot of those stories are from the Bible. A lot of those stories are from our tradition. For instance, think of all the stories of the saints of the church. Those are stories that are not contained in the Bible, but which have helped to shape many of us and helped to shape our imagination. And as Catholics, we also pay attention to the teachings of the magisterium, which simply means to those who hold the office of bishop in the church. So that if Archbishop Johnson were to say something, we would respect what he says at a slightly different level than were it to come from just anyone off the street. So the teachings of the magisteriums usually are something to which we pay attention as Catholics. So religious beliefs and stories are not the only stories and beliefs shaping our lives. Think about this for a moment, that there are all sorts of stories that we hear all the time. Some of them come to us from our church, but there are also other stories that come to us from other sources that shape what we do. So when we hear our comadre, compadre, a family member, talk about things that we should or should not do, telling stories about what happened to them and or to other people, those things shape our own decisions. So there are other people who influence us outside our faith. Yes, ideally influences us, but isn't it true that other things influence us too, which is why parents are so worried about their children going off, because what happens is when they go off to school, when our children go off to school, what's happening? They're being influenced by other voices, by other perspectives, by their friends. They're influenced by the media, by what they see on television, by what they're seeing on the internet. They're being influenced by all of these other voices, if you will. And so Richard Gula asks the question, for you, who most influences you when it comes to moral issues? Are you more influenced by the voices that you hear on television and movies and the media, on the internet, etc.? Or are you more influenced by some of the stories of our tradition? Stories from the Bible, stories from the saints, from the tradition of the church, from the preaching of the church and what we hear on Sundays. Does that influence you? We come to church 1 hour a week. That's not a lot in terms of influence, right? Think about that 1 hour of church compared with the number of hours that we dedicate to other things. Watching television or being on the internet. I have a feeling that for many of us, we're on the internet for more than an hour a week, which simply means that we're learning as much, if not more, from that source of wisdom, if you will, than we are from our own faith. Father Richard Gula says that morality, there's an axiom in moral theology, and that axiom is that morality is reality. Morality is reality. How we see a situation influences how we act in that situation. So the reality that we see, that we perceive, influences how it is that we respond to that, what it is that we do. So he says that in any situation that we should be asking ourselves certain questions to determine what actions we should take in those situations. First question, ask, what is the situation? Okay, stop before you act. Remember that model of see, judge, act. Okay, the first part is clearly seeing the situation. What's at stake in this situation? You have to make a decision. Okay, what's involved here? What's going on? The second question, ask who you're becoming. By making certain decisions, how does that influence who you become? Because we remember from our course in ethics, what did Aristotle say? We are the product of our decisions. Every decision that you've made in life has led you to be the person that you are. So by making a certain decision, you're choosing to become a certain person. By choosing a different action, you're choosing to become a different person. So we need to ask who we're becoming, but also who is involved and who's affected by the situation, because we have to think about, wait a minute, in any given situation, who else is going to be affected by my actions? We need to consider the context, essentially the when and the where of our actions. Consider our own motivations, why it is that we're tempted to choose certain things. Considering the how, that is, how it is that we intend to achieve the end, the goal that we have in mind. And then he also invites us, challenges us to consider the consequences, especially the unforeseen consequences of certain actions, so that, yes, we should ask the who, what, where, when, and why, but also what if? What if I choose this action, or what if I choose that action? What will happen, and or what won't happen by the choices that I make? And finally, the last question that he says we should ask is, what else? Not just who, what, where, when, why, and how, and what if, but also what else could I choose in this situation? Because a lot of times, it's simply considering the alternative. Sometimes we think that we don't have a choice. Essentially, his point here is, he says, if there were no alternatives, there would be no moral problem. If there were no alternatives, no choice, then you're not free to choose. You have to do what you're going to do. When there's a choice, when you can choose one or the other, when you can ask, what else could I do, then that's where you have freedom. Father Richard says, too often we make the wrong moral choice, not because we're bad people, but because we're just too unimaginative. We don't ask ourselves what else we could do in that situation. Oh, I have to do this. Wait a minute. What do you mean you have to do that? What else could you do in that situation?